Okay. Great. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our Grand Challenges ICODA webinar series. This one is around using natural language processing to curate unstructured electronic health records into research-ready datasets. This is the third in the series. We've ran two before this, one on Driver Project 1 and one on our Driver Project 2. So we'll send out links after this session to give information about that. This talk is going to be done by Eric Harvey, who is the Senior Director of Biometrics and Data Science at MMS Holdings. MMS was one of our partners used to offer support for our Grand Challenges ICODA projects to help curate the data for some of their studies. And Eric will give you an overview of natural language processing and its use in creating research-ready data sets, and we'll use one of our ICODA Grand Challenges projects, the PRIEST project, as a case study for the work that he's done with their team. Just as a note, this session is being recorded. The recording and the slides for this session will be made available through our website and on our Global Data Health Science digital hub. And we'll send out links where you can access those materials after. The session will be 45 minutes roughly, and then 15 minutes for questions. So if you do have any questions during the session, please write them into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom, and we'll have time to have Eric answer some of those for us. So I'll hand you over to Eric now, who will take you through the presentation. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. I'll just share my slides here. All right, can someone just confirm for me that you can see my slides?
Yep, we can see them, thanks.
Okay, great, thank you, Matt. So, and welcome to everyone. So again, my name's Eric Harvey. I'm a statistician by training, been in the industry for quite a while now. Just want to preface all of this by saying this is not a technical talk. This is targeted at a general audience and high-level concepts. So in case you were worried. And my first exposure really to text analytics in general was way back in graduate school. And I won't tell you how long ago that was, but the focus on the project I worked on was really identifying precedent in the literature for scientific patent claims. So it was very limited to success at that time, largely due to technology. And the follow-up to that was really looking at text analytics to identify authorship by analyzing raw text. So in other words, answering the question, did someone really write the text that's attributed to them? So you'll hear a lot of terms thrown around in the industry and probably already have. So the first is really artificial intelligence. So this in general is teaching computers to model human behavior, whether that's driving, whether that's reading or writing, all sorts of different things would fall under that bucket. So machine learning, which we're talking about today, is really a subset of artificial intelligence. And it's a subset that has to do with teaching computers to learn, aligned with how humans learn. So natural language processing, which we're talking about today, is really a subset of that, which is focused on getting computers to understand written and spoken language, which for those of you that have children, you know it's very difficult to learn language. There are a lot of missteps along the way. So computers make the same mistakes and the same sorts of mistakes. And you may be surprised to know these methods are really not new. They've been applied broadly recently because computer processing and storage capabilities have come along exponentially. And also we have much more data available today in digital format. It's growing exponentially. I think there's been more data created in the last couple of years than there has in the whole history of civilization, just to give you a sense of the scale. And the mathematics behind what we're talking about today can be traced all the way back to 1763. You may have heard of the Reverend Thomas Bayes and Bayesian theorem. So that really is underpinning all we're talking about, but it's basically, in simplest terms, a way of using conditional probabilities to constantly update learning. So everything you learn changes your perception a bit. So that's kind of the underpinning of these models. So let's see, the abstract you already have. I won't go through that. But today's agenda, really, I just started on some overview. I'll give you a little more. We'll go over natural language processing background, and then specific use case related to the Pandemic Respiratory Infection Emergency System Triage, or PRIEST project. And I'd love to know who came up with that acronym. I really like it. And then we'll have a short demo of Amazon Comprehend Medical, cover some additional considerations as you may be thinking about applying these methods, and then we'll conclude. So first, we need to really all be speaking the same language. So I'm going to cover a few definitions here. One is real-world data, and this is straight out of the FDA guidance documents, which references are below for. But really, real-world data are the data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. So this is a bit of a mouthful. There are some examples below here as to the sources that are typical of real-world data. So EHR data, electronic health records, are an increasing proportion of that. Historically, a lot of the real-world data were related to medical claims data and billing data, largely because there was a lot of that data available, not because it was necessarily really prescriptive for research. And real-world data in product and disease registries, there's an increasing amount of those. As we go into, particularly with the recent pandemic, we have lots more patient-generated data, including in-home use settings and data gathered from what I'll call non-traditional sources. So all of this is related really with the final bullet. None of this is purpose collected for research. So the data are quite noisy. They can require extensive manual cleanup to be usable. All right, a few more definitions. So unstructured data, data that are not organized in any sort of predefined format. They really have less order. And as I mentioned, they must be curated, lots of manual cleanup effort often required to be made research ready. And the focus of the use case presented today is to really help automate that cleanup and the getting it in a format that can be easily used for research. And some examples here are free text medical records coming out of EHRs, again, largely, video and audio sources, whether it's for clinical use settings or other applications. And then social media data is perhaps one of the largest sources, actually, sometimes used for post-marketing surveillance for approved drug products. And then what we're talking about today, natural language processing, as I mentioned, it's a machine learning method, and it's really using a technique applied to allow computers to understand written and spoken language. So this is, depending on the application, I want to emphasize that this is not 100% accurate. Right now, the methods are advancing. It's still not quite on par for most applications with human language understanding. That's probably not surprising for any of you that have used some of these examples. For example, Alexa, sorry for the typo there, Siri, and then voice GPS navigation. You know, sometimes, particularly for people with accents or speaking in different times of dialect or using slang, those are not well understood by computers just yet. And then finally, last definition here, data curation is organizing and abstracting data at the highest level, really for use in clinical research. And this best used when utilizing appropriate tools or technology because of the volume of the data. There's so much manual effort here. So any automation we can do is going to save a lot of labor across our industry. And there's a note here at the bottom, just in case you want to learn more about machine learning. All right, so we have a lot of barriers, and I'm not one to focus on the barriers, rather the solution, but want to notate them here for you. We mentioned that quality data are really hard to come by. They're expensive, time-consuming to collect. They often require specialized resources to do so. I mentioned the cleaning already. Data are messy, and as a statistician, most will tell you bigger is better in terms of sample size. I'm here to tell you today that's not always the case. It depends on the quality of the data. So there's also an increasing global focus on data privacy and security restrictions. So basically, this is causing us to jump through additional hoops to get access to data at times, and rightly so in many cases. So I mentioned data sources vary in quality. So the reason this is so important to clean up is that outliers and inaccurate data can actually bias your results. And you may not realize that until the very end of your study, unfortunately, when it's maybe too late to clean up. So, and then lastly, the adverse event impact of really pandemics recently and world events has hampered patient recruiting. So opportunities for electronic healthcare records in general, this statistic varies. I did try to find a reference, but the literature does quote, depending on the source, 80 to 90% of medical data are currently unstructured. So in other words, they're really unavailable for use in research until they're cleaned up and curated. So there are increasing data interconnectedness across all of our primary and secondary care systems. Many countries, of course, have national healthcare now, which theoretically makes centralized databases easier and more available. And then lastly, there's a global initiative in data transparency to make more research available with those data being available through anonymization efforts so that they're not traceable to the source. So data curation, machine learning technologies really, at the end of the day, make real world data more accessible for use in clinical research. And I do want to mention, you'll see this in a minute, but you may have heard the term black box. This is sort of a barrier to adoption of some of these methods we'll talk about, because people like to understand how the results were generated. And that's not always clear with machine learning because there's too many layers in between to understand. It's not as simple as if-then rules, for example. So a bit more NLP background. So 10,000-foot overview here. So we start with unstructured text on the left there. We feed it to some text analytics engine. And we do additional data curation, which are the data cleaning I talked about. And we end up with structured data that can be applied for use in research. Now, down at the bottom here is an example of sort of what I call the black box, but this is a very simplified schematic of how neural networks, which underpin natural language processing, work. But the point I want to make is that the way people came up with these ideas are based on neurologists' current understanding of how humans learn. So it's really trying to model the human brain at the end of the day to the degree that it can. All right, so how does an NLP learn? And by extension, does it actually learn? So it requires labeled training data. And these data are the biggest limitation to the adoption of machine learning systems and, of course, NLP systems by extension. So labeled training data are data that contain both the unstructured source data and often human curated correct answer or outcome. So basically what you're doing is giving the computer the data and telling it what the outcome should be. And the computer is inferring how to get from the input to the desired output. And it's really a highly iterative process with lots of feedback loops. So the best analogy I can give here is for those of you who have ever solved mazes, maybe as a kid, each wrong turn requires backtracking and trying out a different path, right? And essentially NLP is doing the same thing, only it's much more complicated because it's actually solving separate mazes for each text entity when we're talking about unstructured text, and all of this at the same time. So think of a stack of hundreds or even thousands of mazes, depending on the size of the system, and you can begin to get a sense of the complexity. And fortunately, there are large pre-trained models in our industry. So I'll go over an example of a few of those, but this is addressed at eliminating the barrier to adoption in our industry, right? Because we can't come up, most of us, with millions of records that have both the source data and the desired output. So, and the diagram at the bottom really just tells us how we get through this with the feedback loop included. And the black box really, though pictured as a single box here, has dozens, if not hundreds of layers of, if you think back to those mazes. So that's just it in a nutshell, but obviously much more complicated, lots of theory. But the good news is that it's getting more accessible to non-technical people. So some use cases are really, MMS has been involved in these use cases under these bullets, but and then broadly speaking, some sample applications at the bottom. But patient classification, really the result of today's use case. Extracting key safety data such as medications, medical history, adverse reactions. I'll add lab values to that as well. So we can pull that straight out of physician case notes, care notes, and put them in a controlled format such as a database. One of the things MMS was involved in early was post-marketing surveillance. So looking at sentiment analysis, which is basically looking at social media data in this application and determining how people were feeling about the medicine, right? Outside of the formal adverse event reporting, how they were feeling, and also if there were any additional safety signals in that data, the social media data. And then lastly, targeted recruitment. We can do IE, inclusion-exclusion criteria evaluation very quickly with these types of technologies. Going through extensive case histories can be very difficult, as many of you know. I remember when I used to work in a hospital system, some patients had probably 24 inches or more of charts if you stack them on top of each other. So that was obviously a lot of manual data at the time. And then really sample applications that we're seeing a lot more of in our work anyway, firstly in rare disease. So this often requires getting creative about data sources because there are so few patients that have these diseases. Same thing with the disease registries, right? This is why we do it, but the data are often unstructured because we can't be picky about where they come from sometimes. Also, long-term follow-up is another application. So particularly keeping in mind that over time, particularly in oncology studies, things like that, that have 10+ year follow-ups often, the diagnostic criteria can change over time. So this allows you to kind of automatically pull out some of those criteria that may be necessary for the new diagnosis. And lastly, decentralized clinical trials. So this is an emerging area, but really it's exactly what it says. It's trying to collect data outside of the traditional clinic or hospital care system through largely home monitoring devices, sensors, home patient visits, et cetera. So all of these are generating a lot more data for us that NLP can be useful in. And the industry is really just beginning to realize the potential. And just in general, what do I need to get started? So if you haven't ever used or seen natural language processing, firstly, we make sure that you have a business need that this can be helpful in. NLP is a bit of a hammer, but it's not useful for every situation, right? So we want to use the best tools available. You need some unstructured or other data source that you are trying to achieve the targeted formatted data from. You need some sort of text analytics platform, and I'll show you a few, preferably pre-trained, just because I told you earlier about the inability to access large-scale training data sets that are labeled. So that's a huge barrier. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about that today. Data curation plan. So I always advocate a plan to detail your mapping to the final output, because otherwise decisions can get made that are suboptimal. And then finally, this is usually required, personnel with programming or technical ability. So it doesn't require a highly specialized individual, and this is increasingly so, though it can if you're tweaking a model or really trying to tailor a solution depending on your problem. And the key point here is really when we're talking about just what you need to get started and considering use cases, structured data are always desirable. So definitely, if you have the ability to influence the design of the data collection, please try to add as much structure as you can. just makes our lives easier. All right, so some NLP limitations, and I mentioned some of these already. So obviously not 100% accurate. One of the things that you may have heard about is sort of artificial intelligence accountability. So this refers to the facts that models can learn spurious patterns if you don't give it representative data. So there are some cases of this in the industry. So for example, you may have heard, this is an NLP, but it is artificial intelligence. Tesla automobiles had self-driving feature, and you may have read some of the widely publicized accounts of the AI failing and resulting, unfortunately, in car crashes. And then text analytics example, after 9/11, actually, we did a lot more analysis in intelligence services, but what they found out was that text analytics is not very good at identifying terrorism chatter. So unfortunately, it did mislabel some people that had to go through uncomfortable investigation with that. So it can go wrong, and those are just a few examples. So we have lower accuracy typically for data types not well represented in the model. So slang, abbreviations, if you're talking about less formal data, for example, it can't recognize emojis. So not all languages are well representative in the systems. We'll cover that in a minute. And then we talked about manual review. And then also the last point, we talked about modification of the out-of-the-box models can require a more specialized resource. So please consult data scientists if needed. So I'm not going to go into these links, but I wanted you to have them here. There are 3 major companies that have really pre-trained these NLP models in our industry. And many of these systems are built into products you may use every day. There are EHR systems that have these in the back end. Certainly, we've developed a system called datasets at MMS that utilizes these as well. Now, Amazon Comprehend Medical is the one that we use for the PRIEST example. I'll show you why in a minute. That use case utilizes AWS. Microsoft Text Analytics for Health is another large one. And of course, we wouldn't be complete without Google Healthcare and their natural language processing ability. So now I'll jump into the use case quickly here. Again, this was the PRIEST study. So on the ICODA PRIEST study. So the goal here, and this is right off their website at the bottom here in case you want to refer to it, but to develop a COVID-19 focused risk assessment tool. So what clinicians were trying to do was to figure out quickly whether a patient needs emergency care or they can discharge them home. So somewhat often a complicated decision, right? But this was an automated tool that could help them make that decision, was the goal. And it utilizes data on 50,000 patients, so all with suspected COVID from 3 countries here. Well, 2 countries, 1 region, so United Kingdom, Africa, and Sudan. We really had to focus on low to middle income countries, and this use case utilized the Sudanese data, though there's no reason that it couldn't be extrapolated to any sort of data with a similar structure and purpose. All right, so here's in a nutshell what we were trying to do. We received a file from the team containing unstructured case notes for several thousand individuals. We applied natural language processing, and we selected this primarily because of the large effort to manually process the data into a structured form. It just takes hundreds or even thousands of hours in some cases to go through these records manually. And the goal in the end here was to provide a patient level diagnosis flag, which we did not have for these patients. And this was used later in the modeling to solve the research goal that I mentioned previously. So we started with unstructured case notes, and these are the 10 or so diagnoses that we were attempting to pull from those notes. So I will show you kind of what the output data look like here. Firstly, this was the flow chart from the study, quite complicated. I won't delve into it too much. Circled in red here is a step we're talking about today, which is really the NLP text analytics piece. But I just want everyone to be aware that there is some data plumbing, I'll call it, required on the front end to obviously collect the data and get it into the system, as well as the back end, taking the results from the text analytics and formatting them appropriately. So that's where data curation comes in. So the results from AWS Comprehend Medical were really, this is just an example. This is not utilizing study data. So if you look in the lower left, you can see the attribution there is from the Amazon documentation. I do want to point out, in case this is a question later, that there is a 20,000 character limit currently on an individual record that can be analyzed by this system. So that's quite lengthy if you think about it. And you can always break your data up in chunks as well if you have longer data. So on the right here, you can see the results. So this is a graphical representation that comes out of directly out of the system. We used an application programming interface. Obviously, we're not going to do this manually for each record and look at the diagram. So we used automation throughout that. So you can see here, it's color coded. You can see all the quite good graphic, I think. And this is just a partial snippet of it. You'll see the complete one in a minute. But it can pull out the demographics sort of in the orange color here. You see kind of the timing of the event, the procedure names. You see it pulls out the signs and symptoms. Here's some dosing information down here. You can see it pulled out not only the medication name, but the dose and the route of administration, also the frequency. So I won't go into this in detail, but you can get the picture that we can pull out a lot of useful information here quickly. So I also wanted to highlight what comes out of the model. So it's not just those terms we just saw. Circled in red here for age, as an example, you see there's a score for each entity or term that comes out of the model. This score is what I'll call a confidence score, but it's not really a probability, but it scales between 0 and 1. So obviously 0.9997 here, quite good. It is very confident that it identified age in the model correctly. Obviously, that's an easy one to come by. The next one here is high school teacher or occupation. He calls it profession. Obviously, it's a little lower here because probably the training data didn't have a lot of high school teachers, would be my guess, or may not have focused on pulling out profession. But anyway, you can see these scores for each term. So what I will talk about later is a way that you might determine a QC procedure based on this score. So focusing on terms that have lower scores. And that threshold will depend on your application and decision-making plans for your data. All right, this will probably be very cryptic to a lot of you not familiar with programming, but I will just call out, this is a single record. So I just wanted to show you, we have the score being coming out of the data. We have what I'll call the entity name, blood pressure here in blue. We have the green is the entity category, which is a treatment procedure, and then the test value. And then down here at the bottom, you see, I think the colors may be a bit off here, but you see it pulled out the blood pressure here. So very high confidence that it pulled out the blood pressure out of the free text. So here at the end of the day is what we came up with for PRIEST. So we had a yes or no flag for each of these diagnoses that were targets by the group. So you can see each row represents a patient. The first patient had a yes for chronic lung disease. Second patient had flags for, let's see, hypertension and renal impairment. So that's just to illustrate, and again, not real data, but that multiple diagnoses can come out of the data, and the algorithm does recognize those. All right. So why Amazon Web Services for ICODA, this PRIEST project? Again, we compared, really we consider two systems, Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure. So the main reason that we chose AWS for ICODA was that it had a lot of negations, what I'll call, as an example here, it may say no history of A, B, or C. So the computer does not often recognize the conjunctions easily. So that or is throwing off the Azure results. So it pairs the no history part with the A, and then incorrectly assumes that we had a history of B or C because they're not prefaced by no history. So there are ways to tweak this model and train it to remove this limitation. In this case, we use straight out of the box results. So AWS actually correctly paired the no history with A, B, and C in that case. And this is just a simple example. There are lots of other negation types there, but that was a common one. So I want to point out too that the platforms provide the capability to fine tune the models. So I often get asked, what is the best platform or system for analyzing these type of data? And I can't answer. It really depends on your application, right? And the training data that was used for the model. All right, so now I'm going to pull my screen over here and show you a quick demo of Amazon Comprehend Medical. And I will go ahead and copy my sample data over here. Okay, so what you're seeing is Amazon Comprehend Medical web interface. So this is a way to set up your automation with application programming interfaces, but they also have a real-time analysis feature, which I will demonstrate today. So if you click on real-time analysis, it already has some sample data here. I'll paste mine in, which also matches the results you saw on the slide. And all we do is click Analyze here. And so there's the data input here. And you see that it created this plot, which I had a screenshot of within the slides. So you see it got all the relationships pretty well defined here. I don't see anything. Sometimes I look at these visual plots just to see the types of biases the model might have. But in this case, most seems pretty much spot on, as you might expect with an example. The more convoluted the data, obviously, the less accuracy you may see here. What I do want to scroll down here is the results. So you see, I went over the age example with the scoring, but you see it has the category of information, the type of information within that category, as well as a score. So you can see things like, let's scroll down to some of the diagnoses. So you can see there's a medical condition, a diagnosis name, heart palpitations. So it scored that very highly. So we've got a system organ site here. That's the location, obviously, the chest, chest pressure, sleeping trouble. So you can see there are a lot of pages of this. So there was a rash in the data, itchy is related to rash, etc. So you can begin to see how this can be useful, I hope. Now, I mentioned these scores being useful for QC purposes. We'll talk about this more in a minute, but when you do have the list of proposed terms from the model, you do also get this score associated with each term. So what we've done and proposed to the ICODA PRIEST team was to utilize a threshold below which a manual review would be performed. So I forgot the threshold we proposed, but something like 0.7 makes sense for a lot of applications. And again, it depends on what you're using the data for. So that's the entities. I will show you these other tabs too. You get a lot for free out of these models. You can see here, same frequency, but it begins to give you scores about proposed coding type of things. So it calls it medical ontologies. I'll show you the slide later, but you can see it gives you a lot of information about useful things for diagnoses and extracting concepts. One of the things we use a lot in our research are the SNOMED concepts, the SNOMED coding. So you can see how quick it is, hopefully, too. This is in real time. It's not a very lengthy text processing, but you can see it's very fast. Calls using the automatic interface, the API, happen in a matter of fractions of a second in general. So computers have come a long way. It is all cloud-based, so all the processing does happen in the cloud. So you can see the terms here. It will, cardiac catheterization was the text. And you can see it infers some terms here, right? Cardiac catheterization, it gives you a score. That's probably the one that it would most likely code to, but there are others that you could consider as related terms. So hope that makes sense to everyone. I know we have a mixed audience here in terms of backgrounds. The other tabs, really, ICD-10, you probably may not have a use for this. Usually we start with ICD-9 or 10 coding and try to extract relationships, but this will actually pull out those codes for you in case some hospital billing tools use methods like this in the back end to pull out their coding and actually optimize coding for billing purposes. All right, so that's that. I'm going to show you very quickly as a bonus here. This is Microsoft Azure's text analytics platform. Again, I'll paste the text in here, and I will click Run here. And you can see you get same text, you get a similar diagram. Not as colorful. And then it also has some additional capability to extract other types of data, for example, protected health information, et cetera. So I won't go into the other capabilities here, but you can see these systems do similar things. And what I would propose, if you are building the most accurate system you can, you try multiple systems and do what's called model averaging. So you compare the results from each system and you aggregate those into sort of a voting system and come up with the best possible analysis. Now, definitely not possible. That adds another layer of complexity if you don't have access to multiple systems, but you can also try multiple models within the same system and see how they vary. That's another possibility. So with that, I'll drag the demo over here and I will tell you a little bit about things to look at and additional considerations. So these are based on just a lot of what we've done at MMS and just general industry standards. So really, quality control is one of the biggest questions I get. Obviously, you want to verify that your data going in are correct and read correctly. You want to make sure that your output data have certain metadata, such as the desired expected number of records, are going to the right file or in the right structure, etc. So that's the input and the output layer, thinking back to that earlier diagram. But in terms of QCing the NLP itself, there are two methods we have used. One is, for those of you used to quality control, you may have seen the square root of n+1 rule, and it's documented there in a link below, widely accepted in industry. But basically, if you have 1 million records, square root of 1 million is 1,000, so you're going to QC 1,000 plus 1 or 1,001 records. And there's a lot of statistics behind why that was chosen, but obviously that can add up quickly for very large data. Some of these EHR data sets have 10 million plus records, so obviously becomes a QC challenge resource-wise. So the one I just talked about, the method for QCing, was based on the confidence score coming out of the natural language processing algorithm. And you can pick the score, but again, 0.7 seems to work for me for most applications, but it depends on available resources and, more importantly, what you're using the data for. What are the consequences of it being incorrect? So that varies greatly. If it's used for regulatory purposes, you would a much higher level. And I will say that I have yet to see text analytics used for any key efficacy results in any regulated or submitted clinical trial. That they are often used for earlier phase trials or for exploratory analysis. Language support. So this is a question I often get again. So Microsoft and Google platforms support a lot of languages. I can't even keep up, but greater than 90 at this point. So the problem here is it's a bit artificially inflated, because what Microsoft and Google do for most languages is first use a translation tool to translate to English, which was largely what their model was trained on. So you guys probably have all used Google Translate or are familiar with it. It's not 100% accurate. So you lose some accuracy by auto-translating languages first before you input those to the NLP model. And that reduces overall accuracy. So Microsoft and Google are both trained, I believe, on a few language types, but support the translation feature as a pre-input first for most languages. AWS has a little bit different model. You can certainly pre-translate language there to insert it in AWS. But these are the languages on the right that are directly supported by AWS. They were actually trained in these native languages. So accuracy should be better. But again, there's lots of conflicting literature out there if you're curious, comparing models for different applications. And again, I'm technology agnostic. I've used all of these for different purposes at times. So medical vocabularies or ontologies, these are the widely supported ones on the left coming out of NLP. So in other words, it will recognize these systems and code them appropriately. The ones not on the list here are WHO drug and MEDRA, which also can be translated by extension. So really the key take-homes here are that standardized terminology is key to consistency across our data sources. So we're working in an era in our industry of many, many data sources, many we haven't seen before or used before. So the degree that we can standardize those will be greatly helpful. And then also labor savings we've mentioned before. Again, not a perfect mapping, but if it's, you know, high enough accuracy for your purpose, it can save you lots of manual hours. All right, cost. I'm not going to say much at all about this because honestly, these systems have fairly complex pricing strategies. My general comment is that cost is on the decline, and the factors that input into the cost are typically, among many other things, such as the server size, et cetera, but based on the number of NLP calls. In other words, you can think of it as the number of patients or the number of text records, unstructured text records you process. And then also the size can influence it as well. If you're feeding it, you know, I think I mentioned AWS has a 20,000 character limit, so large documents have to be broken up. But if you're feeding it consistently several sentence records, that's lower cost, for example, than feeding it consistently 20,000 character records. Hopefully that makes sense. And also, I think prices seem to be about roughly equivalent across the three major platforms. They're all competing with each other, so just makes sense. Just quickly, since we're almost ready for the Q&A period. So I wanted to mention, in case people are curious and familiar with open source software, there are tools out there that can be used without payment. So the most popular really are in the Python programming language currently. PyTorch NLP, and the link is there if you're curious, is one of the best known. So I will preface this with kind of the buyer beware. Sometimes you do get what you pay for, but the pros are the software is free and sensitive data can stay at your site. So as I mentioned, many of these other tools are cloud-based. So your data must go through a secure portal to get to those engines. So that is an issue for some sites, depending on the data and the restrictions. So cons are that technical resources may be needed. It may require additional computing power just because you're not doing that computing in the cloud anymore. You're doing it on your company's computers. And then it's a little more complex to set up. And the last is probably the biggest issue, is that, as we described earlier, you need labeled training data. You really need to train your own models. There are some publicly available data sets that can help. I would say they're incomplete for many applications, but they are improving. There is a very active research community in this space, in the open source space. So with that, I'll jump to conclusions here. Just a few of my thoughts, so take them for what they're worth. So natural language processing, I mentioned the accuracy is improving rapidly. I remember when I first started in text analytics many years ago, it was, you could not use it for very large data at all, and the results were often comical. I will say the accuracy is hovering, depending on the application. Industry claims about 80 to 90% accuracy in many applications now. So it does vary widely though. I mentioned the cost is decreasing. The other good news, we have an increasing accessibility. You saw me demo the web-based interfaces for non-technical backgrounds. And then resistance to adoption is lessening. And this goes back to the black box concept, right? If I can't explain how the model got from the input to the output, that may make me less comfortable with the model, right? Even if it does appear to be getting it right most of the time. So I think a lot of the literature is dealing with this right now. AI accountability is a really big thing. If you're curious, go have a search. And then really we can greatly boost the amount of available structured data for research. That's the biggest pro of this. Some real tips here. I would say use it for large data in terms of number of records where 100% manual QC is not feasible. And carefully match your use case with your QC plan. We've talked about that. Consider your application and decision making based on that application. I will say use a pre-trained model where you can, because you may otherwise spend weeks or months trying to train your own model. And then obviously eliminate manual steps wherever you possibly can. And be aware of your limitations, always a good thing. And then just once you set this up, this is the ROI type of thought. Once you set this up, you can quickly apply for new data files of similar application or structure or source. And then these last two are key. You don't want to do this in a vacuum, right? Please meet with stakeholders from other functions to determine what they need and make sure that you're solving the right problem. And then also consults experts as needed. MMS Data Science Group talks to people every day about these types of things. And I'm happy to have those discussions if interested. And then these are two just diagrams I'd like to show quickly in case you're thinking about, how to set up this process in your shop. So I won't go into this in detail, but these are the steps you go through. We talked about basically data discovery through algorithms and analytics today, kind of defining the problem, getting that plan in place, and then doing the analysis within the NLP engine. And the biggest one here, I think, that we stumble on is sharing and decide. We really, and this often goes wrong when you don't do enough discovery or data engineering. If you don't have an appropriate plan, it may fail to meet your needs. So that's just kind of the process as we think about it. Finally, I just wanted to show you kind of how we've organized our data science shop at MMS into 5 pieces, really. The first is probably the most important. We do planning and consulting, what we call the discovery phase. We have developed a technology platform called DataSize, which is purpose-built really to handle these types of real-world data and non-traditional analytics. So we've broken it into 3 pieces there. You see one focused on the curation, which we've been talking about today, but also analytics and data visualizations, interactive web-based dashboards. And lastly, just we have people available should you need them in our FSPs. So that's it for the slides. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Matt for Q&A. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Eric. We've got a few questions in the chat, which is great, but feel free to continue asking questions. If we don't get to answering them all, we'll try to send out some responses to them in the email that will follow this session. So we've got one here. Are there ways to train with a new language? Does this require considerable skill? And if so, how to tweak such models to train them in the native language?
Certainly, that's a great question. And this is, it does require a bit of effort. And that's why I think we've seen people use the auto translation tools to feed them into an existing model, but always better to train in the native language. And all of the systems I talked about today do allow you to train your own models in whatever language you happen to desire. The caveat is that you do need those labeled data. So you do need data with the source data and then the manually curated outcome so that the model can learn from that and infer how to get from point A to point B with new data that are presented to it.
That's great. Just to follow on with that, if you needed that source data and the sort of to compare it, do you need a large quantity of data to sort of have that as training data?
Sure, great question. So in this case, bigger is generally better, provided the data are quality again. The amount of data really depends on the application, but models obviously get more accurate over time with data, but you can train a model with just on the order of several hundred records. and again, depending on the length of the text, things like that. And the other thing I will say, there are other, usually what people do are use a pre-trained model that's available out there and tweak it using their data. That requires much less labeled data for your application. So you can take a trained model, pre-trained model, and teach it new things, essentially, with minimal data.
Great. Does the AWS real-time text analyzer expect the text in JSON format?
No, it does not. It will accept raw text. It will also accept JSON as well. In this particular application for Priest, our input file was a CSV file. But for input format is pretty variable, and it can support most anything.
Great. We've got a question here. Do you have any papers published?
Not currently on this topic, no, but we are looking to put together some case studies and such, and I'll pass that on when it's available.
Brilliant. The example today was about classification, i.e. high-risk patient versus non-high-risk patient. Would it be easy to have a model for a regression problem, i.e. to predict, say, the blood pressure based on text if you didn't have the blood pressure as part of the data?
It would be easy to set up a model to do this. The accuracy is the question, and there are model diagnostic criteria that we can use to determine or estimate the accuracy of that model. So I guess, yes, to answer the question, it would be easy to set up the model. How accurate it is, it may have to be tweaked a bit to improve that accuracy.
Great. We've got another one, data labeling. Is it not possible to use unsupervised learning to circumvent the labor-intensive requirements of labeling large amounts of data?
Yes, so it is possible. That is more often used in other applications of machine learning. Text analytics has particular nuances. The context is quite difficult to figure out sometimes. I think this all started really, text analytics started more or less with keyword searching. So obviously that was very limited. And but that's a good idea. Yes, unsupervised learning can help. It again depends on the complexity of your data. If you're using very long case histories that may be pages and pages of text, that's probably not going to be possible. If you're using shorter sentences or fragments, I think that could be considered.
Brilliant. There's not any more questions in the chat that I can see. Oh, one's just popped up. Did you use the pre-trained models provided by AWS or the public?
Yes, good question. So we use the pre-trained model within AWS. Though we also tried, as I referred, Microsoft Azure as well. And really, I have no favorite system on it. Honestly, like I said, I'm model agnostic, but this particular case, AWS did appear to handle the negations better.
Brilliant. I've got a question or two while we wait for any others. Neil's actually just popped one in. How much time do we think we've saved using this method as opposed to a manual effort?
That is a great question. So that probably would fall better to the Priest team, who took these results and plugged them into their prediction models. But I would guess, I mean, gosh, I don't even want to make a guess, but it's not insignificant time. It's probably on the order of 100+ hours for this, I would say.
Brilliant. You mentioned that the processing happens in the cloud. So this information that you're feeding into the model, to the service is transferred to AWS or Amazon. I guess that introduces some issues in terms of privacy and data governance if data is moving from maybe particular regions. I just wanted to know, is there any other features available to change that setting so the data isn't necessarily moved or it's processed on site?
Yes, Great question. So a couple of thoughts on that. One, all of these major platforms have in-country servers in the cloud. So the data are not leaving the country if not allowed to leave the country. I know GDPR and other regulations stipulate that. The other thing I will say, it's a more expensive option, but you can set up your own servers and install some of these systems. We have not tried that, but it is an option. I would recommend that's more of an enterprise probably application to do it that way.
Great. You mentioned that there's other types of text analytics that's available that's not machine learning. You touched on it a bit in the presentation, but what are some of the factors where you would decide on choosing maybe a more manual text analytics approach as opposed to using an automated, more technical solution?
It really depends on, when I think about that, when I first do the data discovery, which we describe, the first question I really ask are, what are you trying to accomplish with your data? Are you trying to make a key decision based on these data? Are you trying to do an exploratory analysis or publish something? What exactly are you trying to do? So that's what guides my thinking overall. Secondarily to that are the amount of resources available, and then some of the project constraints such as timeline, data availability. Sometimes IRBs, it can be, you have to write it up carefully when you're proposing machine learning models to IRBs. But at the same time, yeah, I think there's a lot of utility here. To do it manually for most applications of any size is probably something I'd not consider without at least a technology augmented tool available, whether it's machine learning, whether it's some sort of targeted review of the data or something like that.
Great. We've got another question in. How do you resolve the ambiguity problem between entities? Is it based on the score?
Yes, so there's several thoughts there, mainly based on what I'm calling the confidence score. That's the easiest way and probably is accurate most of the time. The other piece is you can look at ambiguity entities and manually curate those. And actually, I didn't show it today, but you can feed those back into the machine learning NLP engine. And the next time it sees that ambiguity, it will handle it in the way that you curated the data for. In other words, you gave it a new case to learn from.
Great. How likely is the potential of using this to get retrospective patient data from, say, electronic records with needed consent obtained into a database instead of having some medical professional enter patient data into a case report form or spreadsheet?
Yeah, great question. So that is something we're actually helping some sponsors do at MMS currently. I mentioned one of the potential use cases was, for example, rare disease studies where there are just not a lot of data available outside of the literature or maybe case reports, things like that. So yes, that is definitely possible to automate that and use these type of technologies. Now, I will say with a caveat that I encourage people to set up appropriate QC there, just because the magnitude of some of those things